The first-century Gentile believers and Sunday worship, a historical investigation. What if everything you've been told about Sunday worship in the early church is a lie? What if the idea that first-century Gentile believers worshipped on Sunday in honor of Christ's resurrection is nothing more than a historical myth? If you think this is just a wild theory, stay with me, because today we're going to examine the undeniable facts, and I challenge you to disprove them. For centuries, many have assumed that Sunday worship among Gentile Christians began immediately after Christ's resurrection. The argument goes like this. Because Jesus rose on the first day of the week, his followers, especially Gentiles, automatically abandoned the seventh-day Sabbath and began gathering for worship on Sunday. But is this true? Or is it a later fabrication introduced centuries after the apostles were gone? Let's investigate the evidence. Fact number 1. The first-century church, both Jews and Gentiles, kept the seventh-day Sabbath. The New Testament provides overwhelming evidence that both Jewish and Gentile believers continued to observe the Sabbath on the seventh day, Saturday. Acts 13:42-44 states that Paul preached in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and when the Gentiles heard his message, they requested to hear more on the next Sabbath. If Paul was teaching them that Sunday had replaced the Sabbath, why didn't he simply say, "Come tomorrow," on the first day of the week? But no such thing happens. Instead, Acts 17:2 tells us that it was Paul's custom to go to the synagogue every Sabbath to teach, and Acts 18:4 confirms that he persuaded both Jews and Greeks every Sabbath. Where is the evidence that he instructed Gentiles to abandon the Sabbath for Sunday worship? There is none. Fact number 2. The first time Sunday worship appears in church history is in the 4th century. There is not a single biblical command for Christians, Jew or Gentile, to observe Sunday instead of the Sabbath. The earliest historical references to Sunday worship appear not in the 1st century, not in the 2nd century, but in the 4th century, and not by apostolic decree, but by Roman imperial law. The first known law enforcing Sunday observance was issued by Emperor Constantine in AD 321, over 250 years after the time of the apostles. His decree stated, "On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed." Notice something? This law was not made to honor the resurrection of Christ, but to honor the pagan sun god. Constantine, a lifelong sun worshipper, merely Christianized the pagan day of the sun to unite his empire. If Sunday worship was truly a first-century Christian practice, why did it require a pagan emperor to enforce it centuries later? Fact number 3. Early church fathers confirm that Sabbath keeping was the norm. Early Christian writings confirm that Sunday worship was a later innovation. Church historian Socrates Scholasticus, 5th century, wrote, "Almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week. Yet the Christians of Alexandria and Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this." This statement reveals two critical facts. Sabbath observance was the universal practice in the early Christian world. Sunday worship was an innovation introduced in Rome and Alexandria, not by Christ or the apostles, but by later church leaders. Challenge to skeptics and non-believers. If you still believe that first-century Gentile believers worshipped on Sunday in honor of Christ's resurrection, then prove it. Provide one biblical command from Jesus or the apostles to worship on Sunday instead of the Sabbath. Find one historical document from the 1st or 2nd century that explicitly states that Christians gathered for worship on Sunday to honor the resurrection, but you won't find it, because it doesn't exist. Conclusion. The truth is clear. First-century Gentile believers worshipped on the seventh-day Sabbath. Sunday observance did not originate with Christ, the apostles, or the early church. It came centuries later through pagan influence and imperial law. It's time to reject tradition and return to the truth. The real question is, Will you follow the teachings of Jesus and his apostles, or will you follow the traditions of men? Now, let's see if anyone can prove otherwise.